The weight of wool. The morning of October 15th, 1970, broke grey and cold over the makeshift detention compound in Quang Province. Marine Gunnery Sergeant Carlos Hathcock, known to his spotter and the few who'd earned his trust as White Feather for the pale plume he wore in his boonie hat, crouched in the pre-dawn darkness, watching through field glasses as a patrol of South Vietnamese Rangers prepared to process a group of suspected Viet Cong sympathizers they'd swept up in a village operation the night before. The mist clung to the red earth like smoke, and Hathcock could taste the metallic dampness that came before dawn in this god-forsaken corner of Vietnam. 3 weeks. 3 weeks he'd been tracking a ghost, a sniper who'd been picking off American advisors with surgical precision along Highway 1. The trail had led him to this temporary holding area, where intelligence suggested his quarry might be hiding among the civilian detainees. It was supposed to be routine, scan faces, compare them to grainy photographs, move on. Nothing in his orders had prepared him for what would unfold in the next 72 hours, or for the decision that would haunt him long after his boots left Vietnamese soil. Through his scope, Hathcock studied the wire enclosure. 17 women and children huddled together in the red dirt, their black cotton clothes torn and muddied from the night march. The youngest couldn't have been more than 12. The oldest was a grandmother whose weathered hands shook as she tried to shield 2 small girls from the Rangers' stares. They'd been roused from their homes in a pre-dawn sweep, given minutes to gather belongings before being herded into trucks. Now they waited. The smell of cooking rice drifted from the Rangers' command post, mixing with diesel exhaust and the acrid scent of fear sweat. Hathcock had seen enough detention operations to know the routine. The South Vietnamese forces, frustrated by months of ambushes and booby traps that turned every patrol into Russian roulette, had grown increasingly harsh in their methods. The American advisors officially maintained oversight. Unofficially, they often found pressing reasons to be elsewhere when the questioning began. Lieutenant Duke emerged from his command tent, surveying the detainees with the flat expression of a man who'd long since stopped seeing them as human beings. Hathcock had worked with Duke before, competent in the field, but carrying the particular cruelty that came from fighting an enemy who looked exactly like the people he was supposed to protect. The interpreter, a nervous ARVN corporal named Min, approached Duke with a clipboard and pointed toward the women. "Sir," Min said in broken English for the benefit of Captain Willis, the American advisor, "we begin questions now. These women, they from village where VC sniper hide. They know something." Captain Willis nodded absently, his attention focused on a radio message crackling through his handset. 3 clicks away, another patrol had made contact. The captain's priorities were clear. Manage the tactical situation. Let the South Vietnamese handle the civilians their way. Through his scope, Hathcock could see the fear in the women's faces. They whispered prayers and clutched small bundles, the few possessions they'd been allowed to bring. A young mother held her infant close, rocking slightly as the child began to cry. The grandmother reached for the baby, and after a moment's hesitation, the mother let her take him. The old woman began humming, a low melody that seemed to calm not just the infant, but the other children as well. What happened next would remain burned into Hathcock's memory for the rest of his life. As the interrogation began, the Rangers started separating the women from the children, despite their pleas. The old grandmother was dragged to her feet, her humming replaced by a sharp cry of pain as rough hands pulled her toward a small concrete building that served as the questioning center. The other women began to keen, a sound Hathcock had heard before in Vietnamese villages, but never in circumstances like this. They knew what awaited them in that building. They'd heard stories from other villages, other sweeps. They arranged themselves in a line facing away from the children, shoulders squared despite their terror, trying to shield the little ones from what was about to unfold. Hathcock lowered his field glasses and rubbed his eyes. In sniper school at Quantico, they'd taught him to distinguish targets from civilians, combatants from non-combatants. Clean lines, simple rules. But here in Quang Ngai province, where the enemy wore no uniform and children sometimes carried grenades, those lines had blurred beyond recognition. He thought of his sister's kids back in Arkansas, how they'd clung to their grandmother during last Christmas's thunderstorm. The memory felt like looking at life through the wrong end of a telescope, distant, unreal, impossibly pure. The infants' cries echoed across the compound, mixing with the women's whispered prayers and the harsh voices of the rangers. Somewhere in that wire enclosure might be the answer to 3 weeks of fruitless hunting, but watching the grandmother try to soothe the baby through the fence, Hathcock found himself wondering if some answers came at too high a price. If stories like this make you question what you'd do in someone else's boots, tell us in the comments how you imagine you'd react in this camp. And stay with us for the next chapters. How do you prepare your heart for what duty might ask you to witness? The interrogations began at first light and continued through the sweltering heat of midday. Hathcock maintained his observation post on a small rise overlooking the compound, ostensibly searching for his sniper target among the detainees, but increasingly transfixed by the small dramas of courage and degradation playing out below. By the second day, patterns emerged. The rangers would take one woman at a time to the concrete building, while the others huddled closer together, creating a protective circle around the children. The sessions yielded nothing useful. The women maintained they knew nothing about any sniper, nothing about weapons caches or tunnel systems. After each interrogation, they would return to the wire enclosure, moving more slowly, speaking in whispers, but still arranging themselves between the rangers and the children. Captain Willis received updates from other sectors through his radio. The static-filled reports painting a picture of a war that ebbed and flowed across Quang Ngai province like a deadly tide. Near Da Nang, Marines had taken heavy casualties in an ambush. South of Chu Lai, an ARVN unit had discovered a cache of Russian-made weapons. The Ghost Sniper had struck again 2 days earlier, claiming another advisor near Ankei. "Every day we waste here," Willis muttered to Lieutenant Duke. "That bastard puts another American in a body bag." Duke nodded grimly. "We make them talk. They know something. Village women always know." From his hidden position, Hathcock watched the daily routines take shape. The rangers set up their warming fires at dusk, breaking out sea rations and hot coffee, while the detainees shared whatever meager provisions they'd brought. The grandmother had somehow managed to keep a small bag of rice hidden in her clothes, and Hathcock observed how she portioned it out with mathematical precision, ensuring the children ate first, then the nursing mother, then the other women, leaving almost nothing for herself. The temperature in Quang Ngai province could drop 15 degrees after sunset in October, and the women had brought no blankets, no warm clothing. They huddled together for warmth, the grandmother's voice carrying softly across the compound as she told stories to keep the children calm. Even at a distance, Hathcock could see her hands tracing shapes in the air, probably tales of clever rabbits and wise turtles, the same kinds of stories his own grandmother had told during long winter nights in Arkansas. On the second evening, Corporal Min approached the fence with a cup of hot tea. He spoke quietly to the grandmother in Vietnamese, then passed the cup through the wire. She accepted it with a small bow, her dignity intact despite her circumstances. She took a sip, then passed it to the nursing mother, who drank and passed it on. The cup made its way around the entire group before returning empty to Min. Lieutenant Duke appeared at Min's shoulder, his face darkening. "What are you doing?" he snapped. "The old woman, she is sick, sir. Just tea. Nothing more. No food, no comfort. They talk when they are hungry and cold." Min nodded reluctantly and walked away, but Hathcock had seen something in the young corporal's expression. a crack in the certainty that had sustained him through months of this dirty war. That night, Hathcock found himself thinking about his own grandmother, who died while he was training at Paris Island. She'd been the kind of woman who fed stray dogs and kept soup simmering on the stove for anyone who might need it. "Carlos," she told him once, "the measure of a man isn't in how he treats his friends, but in how he treats people who can't do nothing for him." The memory felt like a splinter under his skin. He tried to push it away, focusing instead on his mission. Somewhere in that compound might be information that could end his 3-week hunt. The ghost sniper had to be stopped. American lives hung in the balance. But as he watched the grandmother wrap her thin arms around a shivering child, he couldn't shake the feeling that something else was hanging in the balance too, something he couldn't quite name, but was terrified of losing. The October air carried the scent of wood smoke and fear, and in the distance artillery rumbled like approaching thunder. The war continued its relentless grind through Quang Ngai province, but here, in this wire enclosure, time seemed suspended, measured only by a grandmother's whispered stories and a baby's quiet breathing. By morning, Hathcock would make a decision that violated every protocol in the book, but for now, he simply watched and waited, caught between duty and something deeper that stirred in his chest like an old, half-forgotten song. When does following orders become harder than breaking them? On the third morning, a supply helicopter brought mail and fresh intelligence reports to the compound. Captain Willis rifled through dispatch folders while Lieutenant Duke studied satellite photographs, searching for patterns in the ghost sniper's movements. The war machine required constant feeding. Coordinates, casualty reports, ammunition counts, body tallies reduced to neat columns of figures. Hathcock received 2 letters, both from home. The first was from his sister Margaret, full of news about her children's school activities and their father's declining health. The second came from his commanding officer at base camp, asking for status updates on the sniper hunt and reminding him that headquarters was growing impatient with the lack of results. He tucked the letters away, unopened, and returned to his observation post. Below, the third day of interrogations had begun with renewed intensity. The Rangers had received word that another American patrol had been hit near Highway 1, 3 wounded, 1 killed. The pressure to extract information had ratcheted up accordingly. Through his scope, Hathcock watched as they brought the grandmother out again. She moved slowly, favoring her left leg, but her back remained straight as she was led to the concrete building. The other women formed their protective circle around the children, their whispered prayers carrying across the compound like smoke. The baby had developed a cough during the night, a harsh, rasping sound that echoed off the compound walls. The young mother rocked him constantly now, but the fever was getting worse. Hathcock had seen enough sick children in Vietnamese villages to know the signs. Without medical attention, the infant might not last another day in these conditions. Corporal Min appeared increasingly troubled as the hours passed. During a break in the interrogations, Hathcock watched him approach Captain Willis with obvious reluctance. "Sir, the baby is very sick. Maybe we call medic?" Willis glanced up from his radio reports with irritation. "These people hide information about American killers. Their problems aren't my concern." "But, sir, is only baby. Maybe the mother. She talk, if we help. They'll talk when they're ready to talk." "That's how this works, Corporal." Min nodded stiffly and walked away, but Hathcock could see the conflict playing across his features. The young interpreter was caught between military duty and human conscience, and the strain was beginning to show. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the compound, the grandmother was returned to the enclosure. She moved even more slowly now, supported by 2 other women who helped her sink down beside the fence. Her weathered face remained composed, but Hathcock could see the cost of the day's session in the way she held her left arm close to her body. The children pressed close to her, seeking comfort, and she began another story despite her obvious pain. Her voice was weaker now, but the cadence remained steady, a lighthouse beacon in the storm of their imprisonment. That evening, as temperatures dropped and the compound settled into its nightly routine, Hathcock finally opened his sister's letter. Margaret wrote about normal things: homework struggles, neighborhood gossip, their father's campaign to grow tomatoes despite Arkansas's unpredictable weather. Reading her familiar handwriting, he felt the vast distance between their worlds stretch like a canyon. "Billy lost his first tooth last week," she wrote. "You should have seen how excited he got when I told him the tooth fairy would visit. He stayed awake half the night waiting. I keep telling the kids stories about their Uncle Carlos the Marine, but sometimes I think they imagine you as some kind of superhero. I hope you're staying safe over there. The news makes it sound like a terrible place." A terrible place. Hathcock looked down at the compound, where women whispered prayers over sick children while their captors planned tomorrow's interrogations. Margaret wasn't wrong, but she wasn't entirely right either. Vietnam was terrible in ways that no letter could convey, but it was also complicated in ways that no news report could capture. The second letter, from his commanding officer, was brief and to the point. "Sniper situation. Requires immediate resolution. Body count mounting. Whatever resources needed, requisition them. Expect results within 72 hours. Results, requirements, resources." The language of war reduced human complexity to simple equations. But Hathcock was beginning to understand that some problems couldn't be solved with mathematics and firepower. In his sniper's pack, he carried 2 wool blankets, standard-issue items for overnight hide construction, meant to prevent body heat from creating thermal signatures that might give away his position. They were olive drab green, stamped with U.S. military markings, worth perhaps $15 each in a PX catalogue. As he watched the grandmother trying to warm the sick infant with her own body heat while the mother wept silently, those blankets became something else entirely. The October night air cut through the compound like a blade, and the baby's coughing grew more frequent. Somewhere in the darkness, artillery rumbled across Quang Ngai province, reminding everyone that this war would continue regardless of what happened in one small detention facility. But for Hathcock, crouched in his hide with his sister's letter in one hand and military orders in the other, the entire conflict seemed to balance on the edge of a single decision. Do you think you'd cling to what you were taught back home, or to what your own eyes see in a place like this? Comment which side you'd lean toward, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. What does duty demand when mercy and mission collide? The fourth day brought news that changed everything. A radio transmission crackled through Captain Willis's handset at 0600 hours. The ghost sniper had struck again, this time near the district headquarters in Quang Ngai City. 2 American advisors dead, 1 wounded. The hunt had become urgent beyond all previous measures. Lieutenant Duke received new orders from higher command: extract information by any means necessary. The gloves, such as they were, had come off entirely. From his observation post, Hathcock watched the compound transform. Additional rangers arrived with specialized equipment. The interrogation sessions grew longer, more intense. The concrete building that had seemed merely threatening now emanated an aura of genuine menace. But it was the small details that haunted him most. The way the grandmother's hands trembled as she tried to comfort the increasingly sick baby. The careful precision with which the women shared their dwindling food supply. The quiet dignity they maintained, even as their situation grew more desperate with each passing hour. Corporal Min made his own small decision that morning. Despite Lieutenant Duke's explicit orders, he brought a cup of water to the fence where the nursing mother sat with her feverish infant. She accepted it gratefully, using a torn piece of cloth to dab the baby's burning forehead. Duke appeared within minutes, his face dark with rage. "I told you no assistance," he said, his voice deadly quiet. "Sir, the baby, he will die without—" "That is not our concern. These people harbor enemies. They choose their fate." But Hathcock could see the conflict in Min's eyes, the same struggle playing out across the young interpreter's conscience that was tearing at his own soul. Orders were orders. Duty was duty. But humanity, it seemed, was also duty of a different sort. The grandmother was taken for her fourth interrogation just after noon, when the sun turned the concrete building into an oven. She emerged 2 hours later, barely able to walk, supported by rangers who deposited her inside the wire like a discarded bundle of rags. The other women gathered around her, offering what comfort they could, but Hathcock could see that her reserves were nearly depleted. That afternoon brought an unexpected visitor, a Red Cross observer named Dr. Elizabeth Larsen, a Norwegian woman in her 50s who arrived in a battered Land Rover flying international protection flags. Her presence changed the compound's atmosphere instantly. Lieutenant Duke met her with barely concealed hostility, while Captain Willis adopted the careful neutrality of a man caught between competing authorities. "I'm here to assess conditions and ensure Geneva Convention compliance," Dr. Larsen announced, her English crisp and uncompromising. "These are enemy sympathizers," Duke replied. "They have information about American deaths. They are civilians under temporary detention," she corrected. "International law applies regardless of suspected affiliations." Hathcock watched through his scope as Dr. Larsen approached the wire enclosure. The women shrank back initially, unsure of this new presence, but the doctor's manner was gentle, professional. She spoke some Vietnamese, enough to ask basic questions about their treatment and physical condition. The grandmother struggled to sit upright as Dr. Larsen knelt by the fence. Their conversation was brief, conducted in a mixture of Vietnamese and French, but Hathcock could see the relief in the old woman's eyes at finally meeting someone whose purpose was purely humanitarian. Dr. Larsen's examination of the sick infant took only moments, but her expression grew increasingly grave. She turned to Captain Willis with barely controlled anger. "This child needs immediate medical attention. Fever, respiratory distress, possible pneumonia. He could die." "They're suspected enemy collaborators," Willis replied. "Medical resources are limited. International law requires—" "Ma'am, with respect, this is a combat zone. Military necessity takes precedence." "Doctor." Larsen's response was interrupted by the sound of helicopters approaching, medevac birds inbound with casualties from that morning's sniper attack. The reminder of American blood spilled by the ghost they were hunting hung in the air like cordite smoke. But as evening approached and temperatures began to drop, Hathcock found himself focused on different calculations. The baby's breathing had become more labored. The grandmother could barely move. The women had huddled together in a tight circle, trying to preserve what little warmth they could generate. In his pack, the 2 wool blankets seemed to weigh more than his rifle and ammunition combined. Standard-issue items meant to prevent thermal signatures during sniper operations. Olive drab green with U.S. military markings, $15 each in any PX catalog. But watching the grandmother try to shelter the dying infant with her own failing body, those blankets had become something else entirely. A test of everything he'd been taught about duty, orders, and the difference between right and necessary. The October night settled over Quang Ngai province like a shroud, and somewhere in the darkness, Hathcock made his choice. At what point does humanity become a form of treason? At 0200 hours, when the guard rotation changed and the compound fell into its deepest quiet, Hathcock slipped from his observation post. He moved with the ghost-like precision that had made him legendary among enemy snipers, crossing 200 meters of open ground without disturbing so much as a pebble. 3 weeks of hunting had honed his stealth to a razor's edge, but tonight he wasn't stalking prey. The 2 wool blankets were bundled under his arm, their olive drab fabric barely visible in the pre-dawn darkness. At the wire, he could hear the children's labored breathing, the soft murmur of women's voices offering what comfort they could. The baby's cough had developed an ominous rattle that echoed off the compound walls with metronomic regularity. The old grandmother was awake. Perhaps she'd never slept. Her eyes met his in the darkness, and for a long moment, neither moved. Here was an American sniper, the kind of man her people had learned to fear above all others, extending a wordless offer of aid to women who might indeed be harboring his enemies. She reached for the blankets slowly, as if expecting them to be yanked away or to explode in her hands. When her fingers touched the wool, her expression crumbled. She began to cry, not the wailing grief Hathcock had heard during the interrogations, but something deeper and more quiet. Gratitude, perhaps, or simply the overwhelming recognition that someone had seen her as human. Within minutes, the blankets had been distributed with the kind of precision that spoke to weeks of hardship shared. The sickest children were wrapped first, then the others, then the women arranged themselves so that everyone received some share of warmth. The transformation was immediate and profound. Bodies relaxed, the infants' coughing subsided. For the first time in 3 days, the compound fell into something approaching peaceful sleep. Hathcock slipped back to his hide, but he couldn't stop watching. The simple act of providing those blankets had shifted something fundamental in the dynamic of the compound. When morning came, the change would prove more significant than he could have imagined. Lieutenant Duke arrived for the day's interrogations to find the grandmother approaching the fence, speaking rapidly to Corporal Min in Vietnamese. The interpreter's eyes widened as he listened. He turned to Duke, gesturing excitedly, then approached Captain Willis. "Sir," the old woman, "she say something important. She say last night, American soldier bring blankets. She think maybe Americans different from what VC tell them. She want to help." The silence that followed was electric. Duke and Willis exchanged glances, both calculating the implications. Willis grabbed his radio handset. "All units, this is base. Report any missing equipment, any unauthorized movement last night. Now." But Hathcock was already making his decision. He keyed his own radio, keeping his voice steady. "Base, this is Overwatch. I made contact with detainees. No security breach. Proceeding with identification mission as ordered." The grandmother's name was Nguyen Thi Lan. What she revealed to Corporal Min in halting Vietnamese would change everything Hathcock thought he knew about his 3-week hunt. Her nephew, a 17-year-old boy named Duke, the same name as the Ranger lieutenant, a bitter irony not lost on anyone present, had been conscripted by local VC cadres 6 months earlier. They taught him to shoot, given him an ancient Mosin Nagant rifle, and sent him to harass American convoys along Highway 1. He was, she revealed with quiet resignation, the ghost that Hathcock had been hunting for 3 weeks. More importantly, she knew where he was hiding. The boy had been trained at a camp 15 kilometers north, near the village of An Hoa. His handlers were local cadres, not hardened NVA regulars, farmers and shopkeepers pressed into service by ideology and fear. The network was small, vulnerable, held together by blood ties and shared desperation rather than professional military discipline. As Min translated her revelations, Hathcock felt the weight of his decision settle over him like those olive-drab blankets. 2 $15 pieces of wool had purchased what 3 weeks of professional hunting could not: the truth about his enemy. But the truth, as it often did, came with complications. The grandmother's information was accurate. Subsequent raids would prove that beyond doubt, but it was also incomplete. The boy she described was not the seasoned killer Hathcock had imagined, but a teenager torn from his family and thrust into a war he barely understood. The sniper's precision hadn't come from years of training, but from desperate fear and a steady rifle in young hands. Dr. Larson appeared at the fence again that morning, her medical bag in hand. Lieutenant Duke made no move to stop her this time, not with valuable intelligence flowing from the wire enclosure. She examined the baby again, then looked directly at Captain Willis. "The fever's breaking," she announced. "Whatever happened last night, it likely saved this child's life." Willis nodded stiffly, avoiding her gaze. Orders were orders, but results were results. The intelligence they'd gained would roll up an entire VC cell, save American lives, bring them one step closer to ending this sector's nightmare. The means, however irregular, had justified themselves. But Hathcock, watching from his hide as the grandmother held the now sleeping infant, understood that some justifications carried their own weight. Those 2 blankets had purchased more than information. They'd bought him a glimpse of the enemy's human face, and that vision would follow him long after he left Vietnamese soil. When the raid came that afternoon, swift and overwhelming, the teenage sniper laid down his weapon without firing a shot. His grandmother's plea, transmitted through Min and delivered by loud hailer, had reached him across the paddies where he'd hidden for 3 weeks. The ghost that had haunted Highway 1 walked into American custody with his hands raised and tears streaming down his face. Which weighs more, the mission that saves soldiers or the choice that saves your soul? The information from Nguyen Thi Lan led to a raid that ended the young sniper's campaign without bloodshed. Faced with overwhelming force and his grandmother's plea to surrender, the 17-year-old boy named Duke laid down his ancient Mosin Nagant rifle and walked into American custody. No more advisors would die on Highway 1, at least not from his barrel. The intelligence gathered from his debriefing rolled up an entire local VC cell, 12 captures, 6 weapons caches, and a network of communication that had been feeding information to enemy units for months. But the real victory, Hathcock realized later, was smaller and more profound. Word of the American sniper who had brought blankets to Vietnamese women spread through the local villages faster than any propaganda leaflet or psychological operations broadcast. It became a story told around cooking fires, passed from grandmother to grandchild, a crack in the narrative that painted all Americans as heartless invaders. Other villagers began approaching American units with information. Children stopped running when patrols passed through their hamlets. The equations of war, for a brief moment in a small corner of Quang Ngai province, had shifted towards something approaching hope. Lieutenant Duke, watching this transformation, found himself questioning methods he'd considered necessary. The brutal interrogations stopped. When Dr. Larson made her final inspection, she found conditions improved beyond recognition. Adequate food, medical attention for the sick baby, basic dignity restored to the detention process. Captain Willis, initially furious about Hathcock's breach of protocol, quietly filed a report that made no mention of missing blankets or unauthorized contact with detainees. The successful intelligence operation spoke for itself, and in a war where victories were measured in body counts and grid squares controlled, results trumped methodology every time. The women and children were released after 5 days, when it became clear they had told everything they knew. As they prepared to leave, Nguyen Thi Lan approached the fence one final time. Through Min, she asked to speak with the American sniper who had brought the blankets. Hathcock emerged from his hide and walked to the wire. The old woman reached through and touched his hand briefly, speaking rapidly in Vietnamese. Min translated slowly, his voice uncertain. She say you are a good man who does bad work, and she will pray that you find peace when the war ends. She say the blanket saved her grandson's life, not from cold, but from hate. The words hit Hathcock harder than any sniper's bullet. A good man who does bad work. It was, he realized, the most accurate description anyone had ever given of his place in this war. The grandmother understood something that military doctrine couldn't teach, that the line between enemy and ally, between right and necessary, wasn't drawn on maps or in regulations, but in the small choices made by individuals facing impossible circumstances. 3 weeks later, Hathcock was rotated back to his base camp. His official mission report noted the successful elimination of an enemy sniper threat through intelligence gathered during routine detention operations. It made no mention of blankets or the grandmother's tears or the way trust could be built with two $15 pieces of wool. Years would pass before Hathcock understood the full weight of what had happened in that compound. The young sniper, Duke Nguyen, spent 6 months in detention before being released as part of a prisoner exchange. According to intelligence reports that filtered back months later, he never returned to the Viet Cong. Instead, he moved to Saigon and found work in a textile factory. Whether this was due to his grandmother's influence, the treatment he'd received in American custody, or simply war weariness, no one could say. Nguyen Thi Lan returned to her village and lived until 1987. In her final years, according to relatives interviewed by historians decades later, she would tell the story of the American sniper and the blankets to her great-grandchildren, adding it to the long oral tradition of her family's survival through war and occupation. The story, like many from that era, emphasized the possibility of humanity even in the darkest circumstances. Corporal Min survived the war and became a teacher in Ho Chi Minh City, where he occasionally spoke to students about the complexity of moral choices in wartime. He never forgot the grandmother's dignity or the American sniper's unexpected mercy, lessons that shaped his approach to education for the rest of his career. Dr. Larsen returned to Norway after the war, carrying with her detailed documentation of conditions in Vietnamese detention facilities. Her reports contributed to improvements in international humanitarian law, specifically regarding the treatment of civilian detainees in combat zones. She never learned the identity of the American soldier whose blankets had saved a baby's life, but she included the incident in her memoir as an example of individual conscience transcending institutional failures. Hathcock himself completed his deployment and returned to the United States, carrying with him the memory of that moment at the wire when fear had transformed into trust through the simplest of gestures. In interviews conducted years later, when his sniper exploits had made him legendary among military historians, he rarely mentioned the incident with the blankets. When pressed, he would only say that sometimes the most important shots were the ones you chose not to take, and sometimes the greatest victories had nothing to do with killing. The true measure of those 3 days in October 1970 couldn't be calculated in enemy casualties or intelligence gathered. It lived instead in the recognition that war's cruelest aspect wasn't the violence itself, but how it trained people to stop seeing each other as human beings. And in the quiet miracle that sometimes, despite everything, that sight could be restored by gestures as simple as sharing warmth in the cold darkness before dawn. 40 years later, in a nursing home in Arkansas, an aging sniper would wake from dreams of Vietnamese grandmothers and feel the phantom weight of wool blankets in his arms. The war had ended, the enemy had become an ally, and the young soldiers on both sides had grown old. But the memory of mercy given and received remained sharp as winter air, a reminder that in the vast machinery of war, individual choices still mattered. The blankets themselves were lost to history, probably discarded or repurposed long ago. But their echo continued. In the villages of Quang Ngai Province, where children learned stories of unexpected kindness, in the conscience of a Marine who understood that courage sometimes meant violating orders, and in the simple truth that humanity, once acknowledged, could never be entirely forgotten. If this story reminded you that even in the darkest times, small acts of humanity still matter, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story. How long does a moment of mercy echo through the lives it touches?